Hello and welcome to the Product Shipping Forecast, where we help you navigate the treacherous waters of product development. I'm Rob, a product designer at Zero Height, and I'm joined by my co-host and product engineering colleague, Rosie.
Hi, Rob.
Rosie, it's been a while since we got on mic to talk about design and development, and that's largely because we've both been at conferences, and I've also been on holiday. We were both at Converge quite recently last month, which Zero Height organises. Should probably label that up top. And then, you were off to NYC for Smashing Conf. How was that?
Well, both were excellent. Obviously, Converge was definitely the best because how could it not be? It was organised by us. But no, it genuinely was great. It was cool to do a nice 2-day conference in the UK. Brighton was a lovely location and all of the speakers were really good. And then, I absolutely enjoyed Smashing Conf in New York as well. It's my first time being to a Smashing Conf, and it definitely lived up to the hype.
I'm very jealous that you were out there. I've been wanting to check that out for a while. Were there any kind of talks that really stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, all of them. It's weird. Usually I go to a conference and there's a few that you're just not that interested in. But this time all of them seemed super interesting, and we were there sort of working a sponsor stand as well, so I did spend some time there. But all the ones I managed to jump into and watch were absolutely amazing. I think there were two different sides to this conference. So there were the super techie ones. So Kevin Powell done something around CSS layouts,
Right.
which sounds really boring on paper, right? And definitely if you just read about it, would be really boring because it was just talking about rather than using pixel widths when it comes to your browser, instead the new concept of containers and stuff, so you can actually size things a bit better. Really boring, but the talk itself super interesting. And although it's not necessarily something that we can directly apply immediately in Zero Height because our CSS is very old, it's definitely something that going forward is a way I'll think about things. And then the other talks were more of what I'd consider inspiring talks. So Jessica Hish, who does a lot of not typography, it's hand drawn typography. Yeah. I can't think of the actual word. Absolutely amazing. Obviously had bestseller books and does so much stuff. I can't do anything she does. I am not that creative. I cannot draw like that. But just listening to her speak, listening to her story, and talking through some of her methodologies was more inspiring, and was oh, actually, although I can't do this, there are other things I'd like to try my hand at and be a bit more, adventurous. She was talking about how you're not just immediately the best at everything, and it takes practice, and it's such it's a generic thing when I say it that way, but when it's put into a really good talk, absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I really would like to see Jessica Hish talk at some point. I've been following her work for a number of years, and it's so good. I'm very, very jealous of how amazing her hand-drawn typography is.
It's absolutely ridiculous that she just does that by hand. I always see these things and I'm yeah, and then when you realise she's doing it all by hand and it's all sort of very unique. It's absolutely amazing. How did you find Converge?
Yeah, Converge was really, really good. I decided not to help out this year. I think, when we did our first one in London, I was kind of manning the ticket desk, and so got to see some talks, but then also had to do other stuff. This year was just nice to, kind of properly soak in the conference and see all the talks that are being given. And I think the quality, again, obviously it's a conference that our company organises, so, take this with a pinch of salt. But I think that the general quality was really high. There were some really interesting talks, I think. I particularly liked Nathan Curtis's. I've not seen him speak before, so really liked his kind of approach, and particularly as we've been thinking a bit about how we expand the work we've been doing on our design system internally. Looking at some of those methods for how you help with contribution and stuff has actually been quite useful. And then otherwise, it was, I really enjoyed Scott Riley's talk. I know he's good friends with Luke, our kind of head of marketing here, but that was a very entertaining talk. Amy Hupe, as always, giving a really, really interesting, thoughtful kind of like talk about some very, very heavy topics, but with a good amount of humour and moodang sprinkled in to kind of lighten the tone a bit.
Very relevant to the times.
Yeah, very much so.
Nice and up to date, which is good.
So yeah, we kind of we thought, given that conferences have been sort of in the space a little bit this past month, we thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit more about how we handle our own learning and development, and particularly thinking about what to kind of be aware of when thinking about going to conferences, whether they're actually useful, and also just how we maybe try and make sure we're up to date with the things that are happening in our industries, and always kind of pushing our own kind of practice forward. So I think getting into conferences is probably like the best place to start with this. I think especially for me, when I think of like learning and development, I think of like how I'm going to use my learning and development budget for the year. Like conferences is like the first thing I look at, and then realize that they may be a little bit too expensive to always be the first thing you use. But yeah, let's start off with this. Like, what was the first conference that you remember going to?
Yeah, I think my first one was actually quite a big one, which I think is maybe backwards to other people. So the first conference I ever went to was Web Summit in Lisbon. I think it is still held in Lisbon every year. I know before they have done sort of other locations. I ended up going back to this in 2017. I was at my first job, and I think I was potentially still interning, technically.
Okay.
And they basically, our company had a spare ticket, and I was asked if I wanted to go along. And I was like, oh, okay. And I didn't really know what to expect at this point. I hadn't even been to like a meetup before. I kind of didn't really know what a conference entailed, other than maybe picking up some free stuff, which I definitely did. That's where my Jira socks and T-shirt are from, which I still love to this day. But yeah, I mean, it was a weird experience. Like travelling abroad with work for the first time was quite fun. The conference itself was huge. So I believe there were 4 tracks the year I was there.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think when you haven't been to a conference before or you don't really know how to navigate them, that probably threw me off a lot and maybe tainted my experience in some ways. Because what I'd done is I'd sat there and I'd looked at all these tracks and I'd tried to pick what I thought would be the talks I was interested in. And I remember one was called The Future of the Browser, and it was being done by someone from Firefox. And I was like, oh my God, yeah. And that's when I learned that you don't go to talks that are done by companies, because they're just big adverts. Yeah, it basically ended up being like, oh, look at our new Firefox Quantum browser that's coming out soon. Really disappointing. However, there were some really good ones. It was just about picking the right ones. And I actually found that with it being a big conference, the majority of good talks I went to were actually the ones on the big stage. They weren't particularly like in depth. They were much more like thought pieces. So they were big names. I'll be honest, it's really bad. The only person I can remember speaking, like by name, I'm terrible with names, is Alfie Days, who is a YouTuber. But what he was actually talking on was like how he took his like very generic like YouTuber vlogging career into like business, and how he started like setting up all these other like companies and stuff. So like what he was talking about was quite interesting. He's the only person I can remember by name without looking back. But yeah, all the ones I went to on the big stage was so much better. I think it had people that were there to talk about like their lives and their experiences, which I think is what I ended up preferring. Yeah. So yeah, like it was definitely a mixed introduction to conferences, but I did still really enjoy it. Do you have any similar experiences from your first time?
I feel like mine is like a little bit of the opposite in a way. So mine was much earlier than 2017. It was probably maybe like, God, I can't remember, like 2013, 2014 potentially. It was still quite early in my career, but I went to Handheld Conference in Cardiff, which I think ran for maybe a couple of years, then morphed into something else, and then sort of died out, unfortunately. But yeah, definitely not the kind of sunny environs of Lisbon, instead of very sort of like grey and drizzly Cardiff. But it's a really fun single track conference with a bunch of kind of like relatively big names in kind of like the sort of web space of that era. You had kind of like Jeffrey Zeldman, Brendan Dawes, who's doing a lot of kind of like sort of data viz art kind of stuff, and kind of like people of that kind of ilk. I remember the talks are generally like pretty entertaining. There was a lot of humor through a lot of that stuff. I think the guy who kind of organized it, I think it was Craig Lockwood, had a good knack for getting people who kind of like had a similar vibe. Like I distinctly remember Ling from the Ling's Cars discount. Like,
oh
yeah, she was on Dragon's Den. Notoriously sort of like chaotic web site. She gave a talk which was chaotic. She came out in like a Dalek being pushed onto stage, which kind of gives you an idea of like the tone of this conference. But yeah, it was a really kind of like fun event, and I think I'm really happy that it was single track. I still don't think I've been to any kind of like multi-track conferences in my time, but not having to like pick and choose between stuff was like so nice for a first conference experience, to just be like, okay, just go into an auditorium, I sit until the breaks happen and go off and then, grab some swag and, try to network, but actually fail at that.
That's what I definitely learned. Different conferences make networking easier or harder. It's been like a real mix. I find any UK-based one, I don't think I've really been able to network. It's very much people want to grab the free stuff. They're probably going with at least one of their co-workers and don't really want to talk. That was where like Smashing Conf and actually last year Hatch Conf in Berlin were both very different. People were much more keen to chat. Not only like both times I was on like a sponsor stand, so obviously you get some people coming over to chat about the company and ask questions about that. But also like sort of mingling afterwards and sort of the after parties and stuff. People actually wanted to chat and have a conversation and network. There were actually people there sort of, either trying to get started in their career or maybe make a move to sort of a different industry.
Yeah, I definitely think that can be a little bit of a challenge with conferences. If you're going out there as someone on your own and you are looking to kind of network and meet people, unless you're kind of very like extroverted and very much open to making that kind of like first step, I think conferences can often be a little bit cliquey. I think
absolutely.
Unlike a meetup where, people would be going like once a month to these things and so are kind of happier to go solo. The big kind of like learning for me was like a lot of times you go to conference, you will maybe chatting to someone while you're kind of waiting for coffee in the morning, and then you'll find out that they're from company X and like 3 or 4 of their colleagues are also with them, or maybe they're there to support one of their colleagues who's doing a talk, and it suddenly becomes very obvious that like people just sort of pocket together like folks they already know, folks they work with, and actually like engaging in further conversations doesn't really happen as much as you'd expect. Like you, I've worked kind of on some of the Zero Height stands when we've sponsored conferences, and I found that to be much better for networking, but that's not very helpful for most other people whose companies won't be sponsoring conferences, or at least not sponsoring conferences they'd be interested in seeing people talk at, or maybe networking with folks at.
Yeah,
so I guess, like,
I think...
No, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think like the further point of that is I've found I was trying to think of one conference that I've been to where I've managed to network and not be on a sponsor stand, which was, this is going to seem like I'm just shouting about our conferences, WDC, which is run by Luke and Alex, but over in Bristol, very small. I think when I went there was like maybe 50 people, but that was actually the first time that I wasn't there to represent Zero Hype. And I actually ended up chatting so well to this sort of like small group of people where all of us had come on our own, that Luke actually at the end of the day questioned whether I already knew them. So there is chances, but I think you really have to pick the super small ones where it essentially is like a one-off meetup versus like Web Summit, no one's going to want to talk to you. It's too big. There's thousands of people.
Yeah. Maybe my problem is just I'm just too introverted, and I'm kind of like, I send off like don't talk to me vibes. Standing there in my coffee, just sort of.
Yeah, much like you send off I drink oat milk vibes, even though you don't. So,
yeah, thanks for that.
Same thing. You're so welcome. Just let the audience know.
So like conferences, though, I think often the big challenge of conferences is they are quite expensive, right? As we sort of mentioned up top, often like people's learning and development budgets won't even stretch to covering a conference ticket. Like the amount of conferences I've looked at, and it's like £1,000, or maybe a little bit less, but higher than what you maybe have available. It kind of does beg the question, like, are conferences actually worth it? Why don't you kick us off with that?
It's a tough one. I think if you'd have asked me a few years ago, I probably would have said no, because I hadn't been to one that I really felt I'd learnt anything from. Until I went to, I think the first time that I went to a conference that I was like, I see the point, was Hatch in Berlin. And it wasn't necessarily that I've come away and I've, learned how to do a specific thing. It was more that I've come away sort of excited and enthused, and like I've definitely heard about new things. It was the same as All Day Hay up in Leeds. I listened to a talk about the new native way to do popovers that doesn't require loads of extra like JavaScript. Again, like super boring, but actually really interesting because it gets you thinking. It gets you like thinking like, oh, there are loads of places that I'm maybe doing things where I don't need to, and then you end up reading into it a bit more. And so I think if you pick the right conference, it definitely can be worth it. And I think for me, especially in terms of like thinking of like learning development budgets and stuff, it's about avoiding the big name ones sometimes, unless you get an opportunity. Because I think, like, I hadn't heard of All Day Hay before. I think it's sort of like mid-popularity tier, maybe. Like, people have heard of it, but it isn't a web summit or like config or something like that. It's sort of one that's not really spoken about loads, but actually the quality of speakers is good. And I think for me, I've over time learnt the names of speakers that are known to be quite good, that have lots of background experience. And now I spend a lot more time looking at like who is speaking versus necessarily what they're speaking about, because I think a title and a description can be very misleading. Whereas knowing that someone comes from like having worked at a few different interesting companies, they, have the experience to bring along. So rather than just talking about popovers, they're instead talking about them in the context of like how you would use those in life. It's the same with, I can't remember her name from Monzo. This is why I'm terrible with names. She did a really interesting talk on like tech migrations. Go on.
Is it Sophie Coonan?
Yes, it is. I was like, I feel like it's Sophie something.
Yeah, we chatted about her before, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, like her talk, it was such, again, arguably a very boring topic, like tech migrations. But the way she delivered the talk was super interesting and quite inspiring. So I do think conferences are worth it. I think it just takes a bit of research, but I don't know if it's different for designers.
I don't think it's that much different, really. I think, like you say, it's about making sure you research like what the conference is about, and who they get to speak. Like even before they kind of announce like speaker lineups, like getting familiar with like what have previous years looked like and what have people kind of taken away from it.
Yeah.
And I think also trying to understand like what it is you want to get out of a conference. I think it's okay if you just want to go to a conference and be inspired and kind of come away like energized about like the work you do as a designer or a developer, and just be like, cool, I'm really jazzed. I can't wait to get back in the office and just like do some design. But also if you want something that's a bit more practical, like knowing where you can get that sort of stuff is, I think, quite important. I think for me, I think it is about like what you're sort of looking for. I also find like specialisms in conferences can be really helpful. So like with design conferences in particular, you have things that run from like sort of general design. So something like Design Matters in Copenhagen, which I went to last year, is like more of like an all-purpose sort of design conference. Leans quite heavily towards like digital design, but that can be, there'll be talks from people from like Duolingo about kind of product design. There'll be folks who are talking about design systems. There'll be people talking about sort of 3D art and using AI and stuff. So very broad range of topics. you're probably going to have much more of like a wider range of hits and misses. Like some stuff will be really great for you, some stuff will maybe like be interesting but not all that for you. Whereas you then compare it to like the more, say, like field specific stuff, like, you know, you've got your design system conferences, you've got your kind of like, you know, your web dev conferences and things like that, which are much more geared into specific like fields or ways of working. I think you're going to often then come out with a lot more kind of like practical stuff potentially from those. So really is about kind of like learning that side of things. The other thing I'd say is like, that, like you mentioned, like following speakers that you really like. I think one thing to keep in mind with that is like a lot of speakers do kind of reuse their kind of like talks, and that's fine, right? Like it's not their day job to go and make you know, a different conference talk for every conference. I know some speakers who do try and change that, but they have like similar ideas they're working with. And I think it's worth keeping that in mind. Like, it isn't the sense of like, oh, okay, like this person's speaking this conference, I should go, because you might just get a similar talk to what you've seen before. That definitely happened to me a couple of years ago. I went to UX London and then Converge, and we had a couple of speakers at Converge that had been at UX London who gave pretty similar talks. And again, totally fine. They are different audiences. You're not expecting people to be at every conference. Like, that would be insane. But it is just something to keep in mind that, you know, if you've seen one person talk, you're maybe good to wait until next year to see them again.
Yeah, there is the whole idea of like conference seasons and everyone just does the same thing. So, yeah, that was one of the points I was going to make. I think it was Nathan Curtis. And yeah, it was like, just like, there was like 2 weeks between the conferences. So, of course, the talk was exactly the same. And yeah, you understand why that is, because it takes a long time to come up with these talks. But yeah, you definitely want to, I think if you are going to multiple conferences in a short space of time, be careful of that. I think for most people, it's unlikely they're going to go to loads in a row unless you're like working at them as well. But yeah, I think along with that, like the only other thing, as I kind of like hinted towards earlier, that I would avoid is just being cautious of like talks done almost by companies versus by people. I think you get so much more value from a person talking, even if they are a big company, you know, even if they're currently at a Amazon or a GitHub or whatever. But as long as it's pitched as that person talking versus here is a talk by GitHub, because that's when I think you come into more of the sort of like advertising style talks where it's like, oh, we've seen this problem and this is how we've built a feature to fill the space. And yes, sometimes you can get like glimpses of interesting things from that where you're like, oh, maybe that will help me, or like, oh, I can see how they've gone from problem to solution. But on the whole, it does just feel like you're watching a really long advert. So yeah, my advice is maybe for at least your first conference, avoid ones that seem to have lots of big companies at them, because they're maybe not as good. I guess the other thing that maybe I don't feel like I know as much about, but I feel like maybe you've done more is sort of like digital events. Like lots of conferences now are not only offering the in-person conference, but also offering it in a digital format at the same time. Have you had much experience with that?
Yeah, I guess a little bit. Obviously, you know, in the kind of design space, you've got Figma's annual conference now, which, you know, they obviously sell tickets for that in person. They then live stream it, but they do make all of the conference talks available like after the event, and you know, you'll see like folks who have done the kind of like conference circuit with a talk will sometimes be at Config, and that's a great way to see that stuff. Like last year, was at Design Matters, one of my favorite talks there was a couple of people from Duolingo were talking about like how they'd incorporated AI, particularly using the ChatGPT 3 in the kind of like some of the learning packages they were using for kind of more premium subscribers. Really interesting like case study on like you know, taking a very business oriented thing of like we want to use AI and be first out with the thing, and then trying to like, okay, how do we find the user problem? How do we actually work with this new thing and kind of explore that? They did a very similar talk at Config as well, which is available online to watch. Highly recommend it. It's really interesting. But that kind of thing has sort of disrupted things a little bit. There are obviously other conferences that are like wholly online that you can kind of subscribe to, and then other conferences will, you know, give you access to videos. And I think actually that's one of the most interesting things with the kind of like multi-track conferences these days is like you can miss stuff, but often you'll be able to get video recordings of the stuff you missed so that you can actually watch it at your leisure. Design Matters, for example, like also gives you access to like their whole archive for like a year after buying it. So it's kind of like a neat little add-on to like the ticket cost, which is reasonably high for Design Matters as well. But it does mean that you get a little bit more kind of like bang for your buck there compared to other conferences that don't have that kind of same option to attendees. But yeah, I guess like have you looked much at any kind of like digital stuff, or is that not something you've really entertained yourself?
Not massively. I've definitely like watched videos back of people doing talks at various conferences. Like I remember actually way back when I went to like a React meetup, and I think it was like Brad Frost back in the day talking about atomic design before it like fully blown up.
Yeah.
And I remember that was actually one that I walked away and I was like, oh, I wish I could watch that again online. And then it like cropped up eventually. And then it was like one that I like, was like, oh, wow, yeah. Nowadays, I don't specifically seek them, but they're the sort of ones that sometimes come up as suggested videos, and so I kind of watch them. And I think it is great that they're shared more widely now. It kind of makes it feel a little bit better that, conference tickets are so expensive. Like, I can't justify them. I'm quite lucky I've been to so many largely because I've just been helping out. So the fact that people then often give away the videos either for free or, for like a cheaper price, I think feels good. It makes it feel a lot more accessible and shares the knowledge around. Otherwise, I think it can end up just, being kept to those that can afford it, which I think is a bit of a shame.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think there's a big challenge with conferences that can often make them feel very exclusionary in that sense, because I remember like very early in my career looking at all these kind of like cool conferences that were like happening that had like these great speakers, and I was like, I'd love to go to this. I'd love to like learn more from like some of the the people who are really pushing like big ideas about like design or the web or technology, and then looking at the price and going, well, I'm earning like this, and I absolutely cannot afford to like pay for a ticket and then travel to the place that the conference is happening and put myself up in a hotel for like a night or two, so that I can not be completely like dead to the world because I'm traveling at strange hours. And when I have since gone to conferences, like the people I have ended up chatting to, you see a lot of like people from very big companies, companies with like huge budgets to be able to send like an entire team of designers to to Copenhagen for a conference, or fly them out to other places. And it really does just kind of feel sometimes like it reinforces like an existing structure in terms of like, oh, these are the people who are the chosen few who get to go to the conferences, who get to work on the cool products, and they get to all meet and like mingle and stuff. And I do think that is a bit of a challenge, and I'm glad that is kind of changing. As much as I have issues with like config itself, as it's very Figma focused. It puts a lot of like focus on like design through the lens of the tool rather than like design as like a practice of like research and like not needing like a design tool to be at the end. Like you can design in code and stuff. But it does mean that a lot of like really great interesting content is available for free for people to consume, which definitely was not the thing when I was starting out like over 10 years ago. Like I would have killed for that back then. So fair play.
No, I understand. I think obviously we started out a bit of different times, so I definitely already had a bit more available on YouTube to start with at the beginning of my career, but it's definitely pumped up, which is good. I guess that kind of maybe brings us on to the next part. Like we're talking about how high cost conferences are, and I guess the whole point of this episode was sort of chat about how you could use your learning and development budget. So there are sort of other ways to do this, and I think one of the other things people often jump to is like books. It generally is like the first thing on a list when a company's like, here's your learning and development budget, you can buy books and other things. Do you find books as a worthwhile purchase when it comes to your sort of like everyday working?
I would probably say so. I think I'm probably quite different to you in the sense that because I'm a designer, I will rationalize a lot of things as learning and development. I know looking at my shelves now and trying to think what I've purchased recently. I bought like a book that's just on the Bauhaus because it's design.
Design.
I really kind of like give a wide remit to like what I constitute as a book that I could learn from, because I think that learning, like I was kind of saying with conferences, it can be anything from being like practical tips to just inspiration, and so I think for me, I lean away from like buying anything that is kind of leaning into the new hotness. So if it's stuff that like, particularly in us working on a design system tool, I tend not to buy a lot of books on design systems themselves. Like, I appreciate there are a lot of folks out there who are writing books about this stuff, but I think things change a bit too rapidly at the moment to feel like I could buy something and have it on my shelf for a few years and be like, this will still be relevant. Stuff that is much more about just general UX practice, research practice, or kind of like product kind of theory, I think is much more worthwhile in terms of like that practical guidance. Like, very early in my career, I bought a copy of Lair Bewley's UX Team of One, which was essentially my Bible for many, many years. I still kind of go back to it every now and again because it's just a great book that kind of talks about how to like explain UX to other people in the business, especially if you're operating as like the sole UXer, which I was doing quite often early in my career. Like how to engage people around that stuff, how to, what kind of tools and techniques you can use. And they're all kind of tools and techniques that are like tested in other fields as well. So like some of it was applicable from when I was studying product design, but really, really interesting, really useful. And like I say, was able to refer to it for many years. Similar with like John Kolko's Exposing the Magic of Design, which is again very much about like workshop practice, about engaging people around the practice and process of design. Those kind of ideas are always kind of applicable because you're just talking about how you sell things to folks.
Yeah.
On the other side of things, like I also really like just reading stuff around like technology, like Future Ethics by Kenneth Bowles is like was something I read a few years back, which is about kind of like trying to understand the impact of the work you have in terms of like, what kind of ethical considerations, like how do you make sure you're not designing something that's going to harm people. And then on the much lighter side, I like collecting books that are just like historic records of how people have treated design, like books on how people have tried to understand like geometry with like really interesting illustrations. Or I have a book on my shelf called Thought Forms, which is this, I think early 1900s kind of like society who got people to like draw their dreams. It was like they were hugely influential on like artists of like the likes of like Kandinsky and Mondrian and folks like that. And it's really interesting just like looking at something like that to see how that has its roots in like what would then inform later sort of visual arts, visual design and stuff. So for me, I cast a wide remit when it comes to this is what my learning and development goes on.
I can tell by the end of that. It's just like going into just like generic artists at this point.
Yeah. But what about you? I mean, I'm always interested when it comes to like developers and like because the reason why I don't buy a lot of like practical stuff is because things change so much. And for me, that's like how I view development is like tools change a lot. Like people are always talking about new kind of like methods and stuff. And so like how does that kind of impact like, the kind of books and the sort of content you're reading and learning from?
Yeah, I mean, it is probably very similar to what you're saying, where you don't necessarily... I don't buy books on, like, React. I don't own a single book on React. I never have. Same with, like, Rails. I think, as you say, they change so rapidly that unless you're willing to, like, read a book, get rid of it, which I don't really like, and then buy another book, it becomes a bit difficult. But I do think there are plenty of books out there that are helpful and plenty that I've read over the time. I think like the first book I remember reading, which I then read again and no longer really agree with all of the parts of, which is controversial, is The Pragmatic Programmer. It's a very like base level book that people talk about in programming. And the idea is to not focus in too much on the code. I think the demonstration, like the demos in there, are all in JavaScript, I believe. But the point isn't about the code. It's more about how you implement the code, doing like shared reusable things and blah, blah, blah. And that was very helpful when I first read it, because it taught me, I went from like, I was at university studying computer science, where you learn lots of fun theory, and then all of a sudden you go into a job and you're like, cool, how do I take this fun theory and like actually apply it? And some of that was hands-on experience, and some of it was actually, it was kind of good to get a base level understanding of like how we take those concepts and apply them. I personally don't like it so much anymore, because I think it's too prescriptive, but that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
But I think there are loads of other ones that I found helpful along the way. I too buy books because they're pretty. I owned 3 Stripe Press books. 1 because they're pretty, but 2 because they do actually have good content. There's one specifically on like teams and organisations, and how to sort of like best form a team, best change teams, and generally like manage the structure of like an organisation when it comes to like the engineering side of things, which I found super helpful. And I'm not necessarily using day to day, but I mean, we've, within Zero Height, I've actually had like a lot of structural changes with the teams and stuff, and I will often reflect back on what I've read from that when it comes to like me forming an opinion on how I think we should structure the teams, whether or not, I think it's a good time to break teams up or merge teams together. I reflect back on that book because there's so much experience put into it. The other things I found that are slightly more maybe like the closest I could think of to like a practical book is I read a book called Product-Led Onboarding back in my last job. It was quite cute. My PM got the team to all buy it, and we week by week all read a chapter and did like a book club, which cute. I would actually recommend like people doing as part of their teams, because we were working on improving the onboarding to our app, and I think the product-led onboarding book's quite small, and each chapter is sort of like 15 pages max, and so we read it. We'd have a good discussion about it, and then we'd try to like take learnings from that and actually apply it to what we were doing in the product. And that's probably the best book I've had that's sort of been a practical thing. I've actually like recommended it to other people because I think it's more like concepts versus exactly what you have to do. Like I haven't bought any like books on AI, because I think unless you're going to read into things like the ethics of it, which I think is super interesting, I think in terms of like the implementation and how to use it, that's going to change so much. I think we're along similar lines there in terms of I'm not buying how-to books, but more sort of books that help me understand why.
It's quite interesting what you're saying about the Stripe Press book on sort of designing organizations and how to kind of like shape a team, because like one of the books I have as well is I can't remember who the authors are on it, but a book called Org Design by Design Orgs, or Org Design for Design Orgs, and that was something I originally bought because I was kind of like moving into like a sort of principal lead role a couple of jobs ago, and I obviously had no idea how to manage a team or anything like that. But I do think even if I wasn't moving into that kind of role, I think it, like reading something that is about like leadership, that's reading something about how you kind of structure and form a team, is so useful for you as you get more senior in your role to be able to articulate, like as you say, like concerns or thoughts you may have around that. Because I think if you spend all your time just kind of focusing in on like the craft, like great. If you just want to be about the craft, that's amazing. But empowering yourself to have the ability and the tools to like question and talk about other things outside of that is also going to help make your job a bit easier down the line. And make sure that it then buys you the time to practice your craft. Like I think especially with designers, and this maybe can segue into our next topic on like learning from the internet. I think designers can often get get the blinkers on and just focus on like, how do we work in this specific tool? How do I push my visual design capabilities? And can often like sort of ignore all the other things that are happening that influence, the work we do and the way it kind of operates. I think the last thing I'd like shout out in that is the Mike Montero book Ruined by Design, which is kind of like quite popular a few years back, which kind of is a very, I would say, forthright view on the ways in which design can damage society and politics, particularly thinking about social media and even stuff like Uber and things, right? In terms of like how it, like it has impacts on kind of migrant workers and lower income workers and other industries and stuff. So that I think is also important to read to kind of understand, like, you aren't just operating in that silo of just like making things look pretty, but giving you then the tools and the the language to kind of say, I don't feel good about this, which can be quite difficult to do. But yeah, before we get into that kind of worms, we both sort of talked about the fact that we don't really go for more kind of like up-to-date practical stuff from books. And obviously I think that's also a little bit harder to get from conferences. So do you find that you end up getting a lot of that from like more from the internet, more from online content? And if so, kind of like where are you kind of like looking for that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's where I try to get it. Not necessarily the best at it. I think it's actually got a lot harder. I think I used to find it easier to keep up to date with things. There were more reliable sources. I used to find Twitter really helpful because people would have like proper conversations on there and would reference new things and share actual learnings, whereas now it's either things I don't want to read, or it's people doing the whole read my thread to find out 10 ways to make your JavaScript better, which I get it, like it's how the algorithm works, but also it just means you're seeing the same content again and again. The other place I used to use, which I don't find as reliable anymore, was Hacker News. Like it used to be really great for seeing like quite niche but new and interesting things. There's still sometimes things on there, but it's also another one where people have almost become too opinionated and too algorithm focused that you end up with a lot of articles that are just sort of quite clickbaity. I think my current favourite place to find things is Substack, because it's all individual creators. There are obviously some like companies and stuff in there, but you can avoid them quite easily. You can really like curate your own news feed. Quite often the people that have sort of like premium subscriptions have some really interesting things going on. They're much more interesting thought pieces that don't just say like, hey, this is the new thing, I have no opinion on it, blah, blah, blah. Instead, it will sort of go in depth as to how you can use it. It will give an interesting thought on it that actually makes you think about it versus just sort of overviewing a new implementation. So that's kind of where I go for my interesting things. I guess the more boring stuff, nowadays I just have to specifically keep up to date with websites. So, like we use React, so using just the React website, right? Like they are good at posting things when they add new things in, and it's boring, but it's the best place to get it. It's the same with like Rails, which is the other thing we use. I find it hard to find a good collation of all of those. Like if there are any, I would love to know. I did try daily.dev as a source, kind of mixed. Again, it's almost half clickbaity now, and I don't think people have properly picked up on it, so it's not really that great.
Yeah, I think something similar has happened with design as well. I think what hasn't helped is like Medium's push into like subscriber only content. The amount of times I open an article, find out it's subscriber only, and then kind of like click away, and maybe that is something I could put my like learning and development budget into, but I find that the hit rate these days with Medium is a lot lower than it used to be. I think people have become more wary about kind of putting all of their content in, one like monolith place, and instead I think people are like starting to peel back to blogs and Substacks and newsletters a bit more, which is great that people have a bit more control over their content and where it lives and things like that, but it makes it much harder to find. I kind of like, just thinking about like learning about where design systems are at and where those are going. Stu Robson's Design Systems Weekly newsletter is like a massive help for me, because like, you know, he does all of the passing through all the content that's been written and just sharing like, here's some interesting articles, and, you know, cutting it down to about 7 things that I might want to read is, you know, much more manageable than trying to find a lot of that stuff myself. And again, I think still following folks on like Twitter and Blue Sky, and trying to kind of, you know, like see when they're talking about stuff that seems interesting. I think there was an article I shared in our Slack actually just the other week that was Preply, I think, was the company talking about how they were like measuring design system adoption and stuff, and that was just something that had like, you know, crossed over the social media feed. So that sort of stuff still happens, but I definitely think it is a lot harder than it used to be to kind of keep on top of those things. And I think I'm finding myself relying more on like, you know, maybe like config and sort of like events happening to kind of surface that stuff up again. Yeah,
for sure. I think I have two regular newsletters that come to my email. One is a lot more generic, which is TLDR, which is more general technology news. So it also includes like, you know, businesses doing Apple making decisions or Tesla doing whatever. And then I think the only one I have that comes to my inbox that's quite like tech focused is actually from X Team, which is a company that does consultancy, but they're like monthly. I think it's monthly newsletter. It's actually very good at surfacing like really interesting like independent articles, and sometimes those are around like things closely related to what we do around design systems. Other times they're way off what I usually work on, and it's some sort of, you know, in-depth thing about a proper like, you know, machine learning thing, but it's interesting and it's different, and I think when you find a good newsletter, it's really helpful. It's just finding them these days. I guess we've done like books, we've done online resources. Is there anything else that you still do now or that you used to do that you find helps your learning and development?
I think the one that I used to do, which I do less of, and I think this has been partly a shift in how things kind of work, is like, until I could actually go to conferences, either because, you know, working as RI, we sponsor stuff, and that means I get to, you know, help out in order to attend. I did a lot of like meetups back when I was like first sort of getting into like the design industry. The UK meetup scene was like, I think, pretty robust on the design side. We used to have like IXDA, UXPA, you had Design Crunch, a bunch of other kind of events. A lot of those all seem to have like fallen by the wayside a little bit. Either like they, you know, stopped either due to the pandemic and never kind of returned, or they were kind of winding down. I think there's just been a lot of problems with like, I occasionally get emails from like Meetup of like, this thing's happening, and I'm like, this does not seem like the thing I ever signed up for originally. And I think that is just, you know, a lot of these events who are very like volunteer led, whilst others that are a bit more kind of like being run for profit. I think their priorities have kind of shifted a little bit. That doesn't kind of line up with what I'm interested in anymore. So I find that quite sad, because those are often like a really good way of getting like that like very concentrated like conference style, where you get like 3 talks in an evening, bit of networking, and like those are always kind of like very fun to do, but they feel like they really aren't part of at least the UK design calendar as much anymore. I don't know if like a similar thing has happened over in the dev side.
It did briefly. It definitely dropped off with like the pandemic and everything. But I think it is starting to come back a bit now. Like I'm starting to see some of the meetups I used to go to kind of pop back up and be a bit more regular. And so far they've not been too, like, one of the other things is because obviously they generally don't make money because they're free. Quite often they're like sponsored by a company, which comes along with my fear of like, oh, they're just going to be massive adverts. But so far it's not been that way. There are, you know, still things knocking about like JS Monthly, React meetups. I think the thing with dev ones is they tend to be much more focused around a technology versus like an idea, which can sometimes be really cool. But but sometimes can end up with all the talks being just like staring at code on a screen, which can be really difficult to digest. But there definitely are more knocking about, and I want to spend some time going to some more, which is good. And hopefully the same happens for designers as well. But I don't really know how to cause that shift, unless you could run one yourself, Rob.
I'll just procrastinate that idea for several months and it will never happen. I guess the other thing that it sort of is more sporadic, I guess, is podcasts. I think design podcasts have always been a little trickier because like design is often quite a visual medium and it makes it very difficult to talk about in that way. But 99% Invisible has always been like a sort of very common thing I listen to, which is kind of like started very designy. It's kind of moved in different directions, but it's like a very generalist, kind of approach for like interesting bits of like design, architecture, art, and how that impacts our everyday lives. That's always quite nice. There's always been some really interesting, inspirational stuff there. And there are a few that have kind of like since finished that I used to really enjoy. I can't remember the names of them now, which is really bad, but they did exist.
Yeah.
I mean, the other one I think I also used to really like actually was a Design Matters podcast that wasn't connected to Design Matters. The conference was connected to the Design Observer website, which did interviews with kind of like designers, creatives, often from like the worlds of like graphic design and sort of type design. I think they probably had like Jessica Hish on there at some point. Yeah. And folks like that. But that has kind of shifted to be more of a general like interview podcast, which is when I kind of like trailed off and I was a bit like, I'm not really interested in this US politics person. So,
Yeah, no, that's fair. I'm very similar with podcasts. I think like it's hard to get, well, I mean, there are dev specific ones, but they're not necessarily the most thrilling to learn, like to listen to, hearing about new protocols or other things. I tend to like listen to more like product focused ones, or like design system focused ones. And yeah, they are a lot. It's sort of like interviewing individual people and talking about their experiences, which means, it can really vary based on the guest. Like sometimes they've got a super interesting experience that I want to hear about. Other times it's just like an area that I'm totally not game for and I just will switch off from. So I don't really have a regular podcast I listen to, work-wise anyway. So yeah, definitely a good source, but again, can be a bit hit or miss, kind of like all the other things that are on the internet. There's so many options now. How is it not going to be hit or miss? Yeah,
very true. I mean, like, this is very much just a podcast where you could say, like, it depends about everything, really. Find the stuff that works for you and, like, stick at it, and hopefully it'll all come good.
There you go. What a good conclusion to the podcast, Rob. All in all, you work it out for yourself. But no, hopefully some of the things we talked about today were helpful. And thank you for listening.